Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to another of the State Historical Society of North Dakota's Conversations with Scholars who are investigating or working in the history and culture of the North Dakota and the Northern Great Plains. My name is Larry Remley. It's my pleasure to host these conversations that deal with, in this particular series, the Northern Plains military frontier in the late 19th century. We are going to be speaking today with Ronald Phil Warner, an historian with the State Historical Society of North Dakota, and our specific topic is the history and role of the menacing sentinel known as Fort Buford in the history of the military frontier on the Northern Plains. And let's begin today by asking, Fort Buford existed for quite some time at the confluence of the Yellowstone and Missouri rivers, and is probably one of the larger of North Dakota state historic sites. Can you explain the reason for this significance given to Fort Buford?
Well, Fort Buford was established because of the gold that was being discovered in western Montana and eastern Idaho. And it was also on the edge of the Indian frontier at that time. And so the importance of the fort grew as the importance of the Americans attempting to move west began to focus in this area. As more and more people were moving in, they were pushing against the Sioux to move out of that area. It was a very prime hunting area, a confluence of the Yellowstone, Missouri rivers. The Indians had gathered there for many years, trading at old Fort Union, the fur post about 3 miles west of Fort Buford. And so it became a very significant depot for the military. Also keep in mind that just north is the international boundary, and north of there is what was then called British Canada. And many proponents of American policy believed that the Canadians were in league with the Indians to continually stir up the Americans. And so a post up there would keep the Canadian Indians at bay, would attempt to keep the American Indians on a friendly basis if possible, and also then prevent resurgence of Indians eastward into the Dakotas.
So this, in other words, Fort Buford had generally three roles. It was a guardian of the border, it was a guardian of transportation and communication east and west, and it was also a protector of the frontier from what were regarded as hostile individuals or hostile peoples.
That's right.
Now, Fort Buford was established when and for what reason?
It was established in 1866, primarily as a protection for the transportation that was going up the Missouri River. There were several methods or routes to get to the gold fields. One of them was up the Missouri River and then past Fort Benton and then on into the gold fields. Also, you could go down the Yellowstone River and get into the southern part of Montana. And gold had been discovered in Montana in 1860-61. By 65, millions of dollars of gold were coming out of this area. Thousands of people were moving into western Montana to, of course, strike it rich in the gold fields. And they would naturally use the route of the Missouri going both up and coming back down with all their fabled riches. And so there was a lot of miners, transportation going back and forth on the river. And so it was decided that these folks needed protection against the hostile Sioux, who had been angered, especially in 1862 in Minnesota. And they had a little uprising there that had caused some consternation among the people in Minnesota. And also there was some movement afoot in Minnesota to make sure that there was a good line of forts west of them to protect them from a resurgence like they had in 1862. I guess the Chambers of Commerce were really at work in Minnesota in 1863, 64, and 65. And a second line of defense even further west of the forts that had been like Fort Wadsworth, Fort Abercrombie, 1 year later Fort Totten in 1867, that was the first line of defense for the Minnesotans. One step west was Fort Buford, Fort Rice, and 1 year later in '67, Fort Stevenson.
So when Fort Buford was established, it was basically considered just a further progression of the military frontier westward.
Right, the military frontier was pushed westward, and it was the farthest west of the posts in that area.
Okay.
There were, of course, posts along the Rockies in Montana, but it left that big area in eastern Montana, southeastern Montana, and northeastern Wyoming, which was some very fabulous hunting grounds for the Sioux. It was kind of their breadbasket.
Well, then Fort Buford was established in 1866. How many troops garrisoned it, and when was it initially built? Can you describe the post as it was initially configured?
In June of 1866, Lieutenant Colonel Rankin and his one company of men came up on a steamer to Fort Union, which had been used by Sully as kind of a depot for supplies, and had left a couple of troops there himself. They didn't want to stay at Fort Union and rebuild that. They believed that because of the years that the Indians had come there to trade, and the alcohol that had been there, and the trading of furs and so forth, was not a good front to project to the Indians. They wanted that strong military projection, and that Uncle Sam meant business. And so they decided that near the confluence of where the Yellowstone came into the Missouri River would be a good place to put a fort. And so in June 13th, Colonel Rankin sailed downstream on the steamer, and they lined out a place for the post, and 2 days later they began to cut logs for the construction of the post. They had to use whatever materials were in the area, primarily cottonwood. They did use some adobe for a couple of the buildings from a nearby former fur trading post, Fort Williams. Why adobe, I don't know, but apparently it had been something that used to much success in the Southwest, and they believed it could be used here in the North as well. And so they established a one-company post. There were 3 officers, and there were 89 enlisted men. Now, Colonel Rankin also brought with him some civilians who had been hired by the Quartermaster Corps to cut the logs, superintend the building, and the troops then were the common laborers. And they were used to build a post, which was completed roughly late November of 1866.
Was this post stockaded?
Yes, it had a full stockade around it, 12-foot stockade on all 4 sides.
Did that stockade prove useful?
Well, it did, I guess, to some degree, in that in the late winter, in fact, in December, pardon me, of 1866, the Sioux, under the leadership of Sitting Bull, decided that it was time that they showed their forces, and perhaps they could scare the military to leave Fort Buford. And so they attacked the fort by occupying the ice house and the sawmill, which were outside the stockade some distance from the fort, perhaps 550 yards or thereabout. And Colonel Rankin had a couple of mountain howitzers, a couple of 12-pounders, which he used to shoot down toward the ice house and sawmill. And they were scared of cannon, far more than they were of rifle fire. And so they moved out that evening. They came back late at night. Next morning they had occupied the place again, the same 2 buildings. This time they were a little angrier, and they destroyed some of the tools that were in the sawmills. And they stayed there most of the day. They were able to withstand that kind of fire most of the day. Finally, toward evening, perhaps because this was getting a little too hot for them, or maybe they were losing interest, they pulled out of there. And the infantry had been lined up along the wall, and they added to the fire that chased the Indians, and they left. However, they came back on the 1st of January of '67 and attempted another little siege of the fort. It was very short-lived, and then they left. So I suppose that early stockade did prove some protection. If not it sure did a lot of good for the psychological benefit of the soldiers inside.
I would imagine it probably did. During that first year, it seems to me that there were rumors that circulated all over the East that Fort Buford had indeed been overrun and that the entire company had been killed. Is that true? And if so,
Yes,
why?
yes. Well, the Philadelphia Inquirer had picked up a rumor. Where it found this rumor, I have no idea. But they said that the entire fort had been killed by as many as 1,600 Indians. And the reason that this rumor was started was that due to the lack of river transportation, it's late in the fall, the river is extremely low, also it freezes over in the wintertime. The nearest fort was Fort Rice, which is south of present-day Mandan, North Dakota, some 200 miles away. They could not get any mail back and forth. And so there was no communication between the isolated post and other forts downstream. So they said that the Indians had attacked, that the entire enlisted men garrison had been wiped out, and that the colonel and his wife had been held prisoner, and the colonel was thrown into the fire as his wife was forced to watch. She was then tied onto a horse and set loose on the prairies to go wherever the horse went, and obviously to her certain death. Also, the paper said that some mail carriers attempting to establish communication with the fort from Fort Rice found her, of course, cut her loose from the horse and took her back to Fort Rice, and was able to save the woman. The Army had no way of establishing either the truth of that rumor or the falsehood of that rumor, and they had to wait until Rankin was able to send first communications, which reached St. Louis in March of 1867. And it was obvious from his report that everything was quite well and that the men were doing good, and nothing of the sort had ever happened.
Well, why then did this kind of fantastic story circulate with regard to Fort Buford? Is that kind of indicative of its isolation and the fact that
Yes.
it was, because it was so isolated, it was romantic to the Eastern press in the United States?
The Eastern press, whether it dealt with Indians, whether it dealt with gold mining and gold strikes, or whether it dealt with the military, was willing and was a virtual fertile field for that sort of rumor. The Indian was either the noble savage or he was the barbarian, and whichever suited their means. Also, it was probably, according to some individuals, fueled by a few business interests a little closer to Fort Buford, such as maybe the Minnesotans or the Iowans, who would like to see the frontier remain in their area as a supply depot. They wanted to be supply depots for the military forts farther west. Once they were relegated to, quote, civilization, they would lose this economic prosperity that came with all the goods flowing through, and so they probably helped fuel it.
So in other words, the Fort Buford's isolation fueled economic interests as well as military purposes.
That's right.
That's very interesting. Did these rumors have any long-term effect on the development of Fort Buford?
Well, not any more than one of the other great myths that has plagued this area, and that is the Great American Desert theory.
And how so?
Well, many soldiers, including Lieutenant General Sherman, believed that this was almost a virtual desert out here. It could never support any type of agriculture, perhaps at best grazing, a pastoral sort of life. Mm-hmm. And in fact, one of the inspector generals that went upstream about 3 days before the first troops arrived suggested that maybe the government give this land to the Indians and pay them for accepting it, because it was entirely worthless as far as they were concerned. And so you have that myth growing up, that nothing could ever be developed out here except perhaps some sheep or cattle raising at
Mm-hmm.
best. And so it's isolated. Nobody wants to go there to settle. Mm-hmm. And so this kind of fuels this rumor. It's a far isolated post, and nobody wants to go there.
And again, does this, I guess what I'm looking for here is does this kind of isolation and these kinds of rumors, do they feed the Army's interest in developing and expanding and further garrisoning the post, Fort Buford?
No, I don't think they helped in that. The Army more or less ignored those. They tried to play them down because of the harm it would do, perhaps, to the policy of the American government in general, of pursuing the enemy, which was the Indians, those who refused to go on reservations very placidly, and they didn't want this to come in jeopardy. You see, you had your Eastern Humanitarians who were trying to establish a peace with all natives. And you had the other group, which was with the military people, saying that if you're going to inhabit this land, you're going to have to move the Indians off of it. And if you can't do it peacefully, you see, you've got to do it with the military. To do it peacefully, you sign a treaty, you give the Indians all this food, and what's going to happen when the treaty begins to run out? Let's say the treaty's for 10 years. Well, the Indians know in 10 years the goods that they're receiving from the government is going to be out, so they'll come down and kill a few more people, harass the military and the civilians, and another treaty will be written, which will guarantee them another 10 or 15 years. General John Pope was very caustic in his statements against the military, against the government and the Eastern Humanitarians for that specific reason. He said that all you were doing was prolonging the problem. You would feed them, you would give them goods, they would behave themselves for a few years, they would come down, they would commit a few crimes, maybe some stealing, harassing, threatening, even maybe a couple of murders. And then you'd rush out there and you would sign another treaty with them, and they would all pledge to be good, to go off and hunt by themselves and leave all the whites alone. And so they didn't want to jeopardize the American foreign policy, and so they tried to downplay, not foreign policy, I suppose, internal policy, but they tried to downplay that sort of rumors.
Okay. How does this impact the development of Buford then?
Well, if you're not pushing your frontier westward, there's no reason to have an enlarged military out there. And if the Indians can be placated, of course, the frontier can continue to move west. And one of the biggest civilizers was a railroad. Okay. Sherman knew that, Sheridan knew that, as well as Grant and others. And so you had the military out there, and sooner or later it was followed by the railroad. And once the railroad got to where the military was at, as far as a post, the settler was right behind. Okay. And so if you could diffuse this sort of situation, then you could have that railroad moving west, and the civilizing effects of the great American civilization would be following.
So the role of the military then was to basically clear the inhabitants already there, clear the natives, to make it possible to bring this transportation, which would then feed additional settlement by Euro-Americans onto that land, and thereby, right. Again, force the Indians further west. Well, let's deal specifically with Buford's development and its part in this whole story. In 1866, it's a one-company post, and expands the next year to a...
Yeah, it expands to a five-company post. A one-company post is isolated and as far away from other civilization as Fort Buford was. You could not hope to hold that against any concerted effort by the Indians. The military, up to this point, had not found out that the Indians were not type of people who would siege a place. It was not like the old European where you would surround the castle and you would stay there until you starved the inhabitants out or you broke down the castle walls. The Indians were a guerrilla-hitting type of fighters. They couldn't sustain a siege for any length of time. But the Americans had yet to learn that. And if they knew it, they sure didn't put it into practice. And so they expanded it to a five-company post in 1867. that necessitated, of course, rebuilding the whole fort. We had a one-company post. It was enlarged to a size of 333 yards by 200 yards. Before, it had been a 360 by 360 foot post, quite small when you consider the two. They built barracks for the 5 companies and for the additional officers that came with it, for the non-commissioned officers. Of course, you would have to increase the subsistence and quartermaster storage houses, and the powder magazine, and all the other outbuildings that go along with this. Stables, and of course, a place for the cattle. You had cattle in order to feed the troops fresh meat.
About, in terms of actual numbers of men, expansion from 1 company to 5 companies is...
Oh, you're talking, given the strength of the companies, it varied, of course, but you were talking maybe 250 to 300 men.
So basically, we're now up into a very substantial complement and garrison. Now, they're all infantry, right?
They're all infantry.
Okay, so in terms of the role of the soldiers over the next several years in the late 1860s and into the 1870s, how does infantry deal with mounted and mobile, controlling mounted and mobile peoples on the Northern Plains?
Well, that was also always an interesting situation. The military officers that were there believed that there should be a couple of companies of cavalry, so that you can, chase after mounted Indians with mounted cavalry. There were some horses there that the infantry would mount and would go out after Indians. There were never, after 1866, early 67, there were never any attacks on the fort itself, but it would be on the cattle herders or the hay contractors, or maybe the woodcutters who were going out bringing in wood, or maybe the water train that was going out to the Missouri River to pick up water for the post. They found quickly that the wells around there were high in sodium and other minerals that gave you diarrhea. And so the wells at the post were used to feed or to water the animals, and the Missouri River continued to be the source of supply of water for the personnel. And so they had to, they would move, they would see Indian congregation, let's say down by the woodcutters, and maybe they menaced them, maybe they were shooting at them, whatever. The infantry would mount a few horses, and mules too, and they would try to follow the Indians, and they never, of course, caught them. Most of the time, by the time they got to the Indians were long gone. But in a give and take situation, over a period of time, the infantry could outmarch cavalry horses. The horses were grain-fed animals, and once they got away from being supported by grain and had to live off the grass of the land, they went downhill very quickly. And so in the long run, the soldiers could keep up with, far behind at first, but they could harass the Indians, as General Crook showed in 1876.
So basically, Fort Buford soldiers during the course of these next several years basically withstood guerrilla attacks from those around them.
And while they were never able to go out and punish the Indians in a battle, they were a thorn in the side of the Indians, so to speak, because that fort was there. The soldiers weren't leaving, and the Indians couldn't dislodge them. Okay. Although they weren't a menace, the fact that they didn't chase the Indians very far, very often, neither could the Indians dislodge the soldiers.
Okay. Well, talking about the life for these 200 to 300 soldiers at the post itself, what kinds of amenities did Fort Buford provide to them during this first decade?
Pretty Spartan life. The barracks were very Spartan. The first barracks were built primarily out of adobe bricks that were put together and kind of cemented in place. They used river sand, which is very poor quality stuff to be using. The soldiers were not good at making these blocks. They didn't allow them to dry sufficiently, and so they were green when they were put in place. They were whitewashed over, and they were finished somewhat on the inside. First of all, they put them on either fieldstone, or they would chop a piece of wood, a big cottonwood tree, and they had them raised above the ground so that air could flow underneath, you see. They were used to the southeast and the southwest. Well, one winter of the old wind blowing through there at 20 miles an hour at 10 below made it extremely difficult to heat those places. And the men were crowded together. They had no bathing facilities, and there really was no washroom. There were some wash basins, but there wasn't a washroom as such. Those men who tried to keep as clean as they could wash their faces and their hands, and maybe a sponge bath as a rarity. Those who were inclined to be a little less hygienic didn't bother washing at all, you know. They just went the winter as they were. The river was the only good place for bathing, and you're not going to bathe in the Missouri River in the middle of winter. The kitchens and mess were attached, and as you would well know, with all the steam that's coming from cooking, that would move into the barracks, provide a high humidity, which would, in wintertime, be a great breeding place for disease. And so there was a lot of upper respiratory diseases. The military did say periodically throughout the medical records that it was a healthy place to be. I suppose when you consider the southeast, south and southeast, in that it was relatively disease-free except for respiratory or gastrointestinal sort of problems.
What kinds of foods did were served the soldiers at Fort Buford?
Well, the Army had some very Spartan diets that they provided. They provided beef, fresh beef, and they provided some beans and some rice and that sort of staple. But all the vegetables had to be grown at the post, in the post garden, or brought upstream on a steamer, if that was possible. Usually, of course, that was canned. One of the problems that they had to worry about was scurvy. And so sauerkraut was a part of their weekly diet, as well as cucumbers, so that they would use that antiscorbics to prevent dysentery, or pardon me, scurvy. Their best place to get goods was a post trader, who was outside of the environs of the fort itself, still on the military reservation. And that was the individual who would bring in all the good stuff in cans and so forth. And with their meager salary of $13 a month, the private, if he was frugal, could go over and perhaps buy a few eggs or maybe some fresh vegetables. The post gardens were a hit-and-miss sort of affair. They were at the mercy of the ever-present grasshoppers, which some years were worse than others. They were at the mercy of the rainfall, and in western North Dakota, in some years that can be pretty slim. And so either they would lose it to grasshoppers or it would dry out. They did use the river bottoms as their gardens, but they were never very successful on an ongoing basis. Some years they had excellent gardens, other years they did not.
Speaking of the post trader, I'm assuming that was also the source for one of the scourges of the frontier military, the alcoholic beverage.
Yes, yes. One of the big problems, well, you don't have a lot of entertainment there. That, of course, varied, and it depended upon you as an individual. The post did have a library, and you could go and you could read Shakespeare or Hawthorne. You could get Century Magazine or Harper's or things of this sort. So if you were of a literary bent, you could read books and magazines. They had a theater there where the men could put together some plays, and so if you had dramatic leanings, you could do that. Beyond that, there was very little in the early days, and so it was down to the post traders for some beer or maybe some wine. or whiskey if he happened to have it. And a lot of money was spent there, and a lot of time was spent there. In fact, it got so bad that Colonel Hazen, when he was there in the 1870s, put out a rule which stated that a man could have only 2 drinks per day, and that the drinks had to be spaced 6 hours apart. And he had hoped that this would help curb the drunkenness on post. One of the big times, of course, is Christmas. And many times the post trader, to show his good spirit, Christmas spirit, as well as thanking the boys for their patronage, would have free booze. And so they really dipped into that. In fact, Washington Matthews one time caustically wrote right after, I think the day after Christmas, that the men indulged in a good amount of Christian drunkenness. So that was a kind of a sore spot. And in fact, some of the early commanding officers were alcoholics, and they proved to be quite a problem for their superiors.
Yeah, I can believe that very, very easily. Speaking with regard to Washington Matthews, who of course was one of the military surgeons at Fort Buford, what kinds of diseases and difficulties, physical difficulties, faced the soldiers?
Well, one of the big diseases that showed up was that of the venereal diseases. There were the Hidatsa had split off in the late 1860s, a group of them under Crow's Flies High from the Fort Berthold group, and he went west, and he went established his camp near Fort Buford. There were also the Assiniboine, who claimed this area as well, and they were mostly north of Fort Buford. And of course the disease had come among them, perhaps by fur traders and the like, and so these people were there. Other soldiers, you know, perhaps brought the disease with them from the east. They would like female companionship as well, and so they visited the Indians a lot, and so syphilis and gonorrhea was a problem. Arthritis among the older soldiers was a problem, as you may well know. Cold weather really was tough on their arthritis. Dysentery, if they didn't watch it, and then of course your upper respiratory infections, colds and influenza and pneumonia, bronchitis and that sort of thing.
How about alcoholism?
Alcoholism was an always ever-present problem that they had to deal with, and I'm sure at this time they did not recognize it as a disease as such, but the symptoms, of course, of that were a rundown physical condition, and a number of men would get lost coming back from the post traders, and they would freeze parts of their body, usually hands and feet. A couple of them died from exposure because they got caught out in the open and couldn't find their way back. There were, other shootings. It was an isolated post, and if you came from the populated east and you were a very gregarious sort of person, and you wanted to go down and have a good time on a Saturday night, that didn't exist at Fort Buford. And so in the mid-70s, there were a rash of self-mutilations. Men would shoot themselves in the foot or in the hand, and then of course blame it as an accident. But Washington Matthews discovered that there was a pattern to this, and he believed it was a reason for getting out of here and going back east. They were useless if they could not use a hand or a foot out here, and so they were sent back east, given a discharge, and sent back to civilization. Mm-hmm. And there were a few suicides by people who just couldn't take the isolation out here.
And the distance from the amenities of life.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting with regard to the lives of soldiers on the frontier. During this first decade, the daily life of a soldier was primarily devoted to what?
Well, it was devoted to just keeping up the fort. I guess we have a distorted view looking at today's military, where you have a lot of people doing the sorts of things that will help them in a war situation. You also have, of course, support troops. They were their own support troops, and so they had to do a double duty. They would get up early in the morning. Reveille would be at 5:30. They would then go down and have breakfast. There would be sick call. If anybody was sick, they would go to see the surgeon. Then they would roll out for fatigue duty, which was getting the water in. The post, and of course depending upon how many men and what time of the year, but they would probably go through 50,000 gallons of water at a given period. And so the water supply had to be daily resupplied. They had to cut wood to bring in, and they had to make hay for the animals, for the horses and for the beef cattle. There was butchering that was done periodically throughout the year to keep the men supplied with fresh beef. In the summertime, certain men were designated to take care of the garden. There were no cooks as such. You didn't come into the Army and be a cook until you got out of the Army. On a monthly basis, maybe 3 months, maybe 2 weeks, they would walk over and they'd say to a soldier, "You are going to be a cook." And they'd hustle him off to the kitchen, and he had to cook. Well, you know what kind of meals that someone who has no interest or no inclination into cooking, what kind of meals he's going to turn out. There was a lot of bread that was baked, so there was a bakery on post. That had to be done on a daily basis. Ice in the winter had to be stored up in the ice house so that during the summer their food could be kept cool, those things that would spoil. And just working on the post in general, guard duty and other special sorts of duties.
And especially repairing buildings.
Repairing buildings, yes, and that sort of stuff. And then, of course, periodically chasing the Indians, and some of them served as mail carriers when necessary, although they tried to contract the mail out to civilians. But periodically the soldiers would have to be used for that.
Let's carry this line of thought into the second decade and a half of the post's existence. How did the routine of a soldier change as the post matured and reached into the 1880s and 1890s?
Well, unfortunately, it never changed a whole lot. It wasn't until the mid to late 80s that water was finally piped from the Missouri River into the post itself. Up until that time, the water wagons, I think they had two 6 or 8 mule team wagons, water wagons, that were used on a daily basis to supply the water to the post. The animals always needed to have hay. Sometimes there were civilian contractors, other times there weren't. Buildings were always in a dilapidated condition. They never seemed to be without need of some repair. There was, of course, always guard duty. There was also always the little forays out to chase the Indians. Even after most of the Indians were on reservations, the Indians couldn't understand the idea that they had to have special passes to leave the reservations. I mean, their old life is when they wanted to go someplace, they got on their horse or they walked, they went somewhere. Now they had to have passes. And that was, the military was then the police to reinforce that they had to be brought back. Maybe they were out harassing the whites, figuratively or otherwise. And so they were used as, the soldiers were used kind of as police force.
So basically the big change in terms of the life of a soldier in the latter years of the post was just simply that there were more amenities more readily available because settlement had caught up to the post.
Settlement. The railroad came in 1887, which meant now that you could go back east a lot easier and a lot quicker. You could bring more of the amenities from the east. The post trader in the late 1880s, I think 88 or 89, the military no longer allowed the trader to sell alcohol to the men. And so what they did was they developed a canteen on post under the watchful eye of an officer. And then they would serve small beer, as they called it, and other light alcoholic drinks. Miller Lite, the sort of a thing. And thereby the officers could regulate how much the men would drink, as opposed to the post trader, who was making a profit off of the men.
So, in other words, just kind of to summarize this line of conversation, the life at Fort Buford, the life for the common soldier and the officers at Fort Buford was never any picnic.
No, it never was. The city of Williston was not established until 1887, and the fort closed down in 1895, and so it wasn't long before the fort died after the railroad came. And so the closest, and I suppose there were some small towns, but the closest big towns were either in Minot in the mid-80s or Bismarck in the 70s. It was the closest.
Both quite some distance away.
Yeah, quite some distance.
Well, let's take the active military history of the post into the middle 70s and then beyond. Obviously, the biggest events in the history of Fort Buford center around the Great Sioux War of 1875 through 1877. Can you describe Fort Buford's role and purpose during that particular time period?
Fort Buford was a military depot for this period of time. When the proclamation went out from the Secretary of the Interior to the Secretary of War that the Indians had not complied with the proclamation that he had issued, Secretary of the Interior, for them to all go on reservations, he turned their future over to the Army. The Indians had always been under the Secretary of the Interior. He was responsible for those who were on reservations. And when those who weren't on reservations didn't comply, those Indians were turned over to the Secretary of War to do as he saw fit, which meant war against them to force them into compliance. General Terry, who was commanding the division, or pardon me, the Department of Dakota out of Fort Snelling at St. Paul, is given the overall command to send his men from Fort Lincoln, the 7th Cavalry, out to Montana because they believed that the Sioux would be along the Tongue River where it met the Yellowstone, hunting and perhaps doing a little sun dancing and that sort of thing. Colonel or General Crook was to come up from the Department of the Platte through Wyoming. And Colonel Gibbon, who is at Fort Ellis in Montana, was to come down from the north in a three-prong attack. Terry, of course, was and Crook were the two major officers in that. Crook was heading the Department of the Platte and Terry the Department of the Dakota. And so Fort Buford, because it is the closest fort from the east side to this area, is going to be the supply depot. Because a large group of men are going to need supplies, the horses are going to need to have forage because, as I said previously, they were grain-fed horses. They couldn't really subsist very well on the native grasses, so they had to have that all brought up, to wherever they were. Custer, of course, we know was defeated and killed, and this necessitated finding these Sioux and punishing them. They called in a very tenacious Indian fighter, Colonel Miles, in his 5th Infantry, and he came up from the southern part of the Great Plains, and his men and horses and everything needed a lot of subsistence, and so that was all brought up the Missouri River from Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and of course farther east, and also via Bismarck because of the railroad that had come in, and then was shipped up to Fort Buford, where it was put on lighter mountain boats that had more shallow depth to them and that they could more easily navigate the shallower rivers in Montana. Mm-hmm. And so the men at Fort Buford never were partakers of these wars from 75 to 77, 78. But they did, they served as guards on the steamers to protect them from Indians attacking the steamers. And at the depots, Glendive Creek, where it runs into the Yellowstone, was made a military depot where a lot of the supplies were stored, and of course that had to be guarded against, not only from Indians, but from the soldiers stealing rations, themselves. And so they were guard duty was their major contribution to this. Also, it was decided in late '76 to establish a fort in this area. If you plant a fort in the middle of the area that the Indians were trying to protect because of its rich game, that of course would put another thorn in their side. And so 2 forts were established. Fort Custer began to be established in '76, and the next year in '77 Fort Keogh was established. All the supplies to build these forts and to supply them had to come up the river, and it came through Fort Buford.
So Fort Buford's soldiers primarily served as escort and supply guards for all of the expeditions in this this 1876-77 era. Did Fort Buford play a role, an actual searching role, or did its troops actually go out and search for Sitting Bull and for Sitting Bull's followers?
In a couple of instances, they did. When it was believed that Sitting Bull was he was already north of the Yellowstone, was heading toward the Missouri River, and perhaps was either about to cross the Missouri River or had done so and was heading for Canada, Colonel Hazen, who was a commanding officer at Fort Buford, was sent out with a couple of companies of men to try to intercept Sitting Bull. He never saw Sitting Bull. Whether Sitting Bull was above him already or not is unknown, but he never did come in contact with Sitting Bull. Also, they were beginning to supply such places as Fort Peck, which was a reservation. It was an Indian agency that would later become a reservation, but it was an Indian agency, and so they supplied the Indian agent there, who was feeding those treaty Indians who were trying to cluster around there to stay away from the military who was harassing the non-treaty Sioux. Later on, a couple of companies under General Terry went upstream on the Missouri on a couple of steamers to try to intercept some of the non-treaty Sioux. And so they did see some of that sort of action, but they were never in the fight as had been the 7th Cavalry or later the 5th Infantry under Colonel Miles.
Then is it fair to conclude that Fort Buford's major contribution was in that unsung era or area of military work called supply and ordnance?
Yeah. They were the I suppose the early truckers of their period, and they had to make sure that the supplies got into the interior where they were needed.
Okay. Fort Buford's next major contribution to the Indian Wars was as the locale where Sitting Bull finally surrendered. Can you describe how that came about and Fort Buford's part in that?
I think another thing as well that we may want to mention is that in '77, when the Nez Perce under Looking Glass and Chief Joseph were fed up with their treatment in the far west in Oregon, they moved into the Department of Dakota because they came across Idaho into western Montana, and they were being chased by the men from the Department of the Northwest. And when they crossed into the Department of Dakota, of course, they then come under the jurisdiction of Terry and whoever he had out here. Colonel Miles was alerted. Colonel Sturgis, the 7th Cavalry, was alerted, and everybody got into the chase. Finally, at northern Montana at Bear Paw Mountain, I believe, they finally surprised the villages of Chief Joseph, and they were able to get him to surrender. He was also taken to Fort Buford, kept there for a few days, and then sent down to Bismarck, where he boarded a train and went east. After '78, most of the Indians that were non-treaty were in Canada. Now, they couldn't stay in Canada simply because the buffalo herds continually stayed south of the international boundaries, and so in order to have food, they had to come south of the boundary. The Canadian government allowed Sitting Bull and his people to come north, and they said as long as he behaved himself, he could stay there, but they were not going to supply him with any annuities. And he called the Queen grandmother, and he was, I guess, a little miffed that grandmother never came across with any goodies for him. And so he stayed north of the border as much as he could, but he was forced to come south to hunt the buffalo. The minute he came across, of course, the Americans were there to harass him. They would have parleys with him, trying to get him to surrender. He didn't. They'd allow him to move back to his village, and then they would attack, and he, of course, would move out of the way. They kept up this cat and mouse game. He was a very feared leader in that they knew he had been at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. How much of an actual war leader he was is open to debate. There were those who, the military I'm sure thought he was one of the best war leaders. He was a medicine man, and so maybe his leadership came through that. But finally, in the late 1870s, he is north of the border, and they're not sure how many men he's got. There were rumors of having 400 warriors or 2,000, and he was a threat. And so they would try to get him to surrender. Terry even went into Canada with a small contingent and talked to him, and he said that he would like to come down, but the conditions that they set for him were such that he could not abide by it. He had to give up his horses, he had to give up his guns, he had to go live on a reservation, he couldn't do what he wanted to, and he wasn't about to give up his freedom. So he refused. By 1881, Gall had surrendered, Low Dog had surrendered, Croaking had surrendered. They were important and close friends of his. Low Dog was even from his own camp. And his forces were dwindling. It was hard to continue to provide the buffalo because of the few warriors that he had. And finally, in 1881, a Frenchman by the name of Legare was introduced by the post-trader, William B. Jordan, at Fort Buford, was introduced to the commanding officer, which was Major Brotherton. Brotherton found out that Legare was friends with Sitting Bull to some degree, had traded with him, and that he then asked Legare to try to convince Sitting Bull to give up. Legare went north, talked to him, and when Sitting Bull came back from a visit into around La Coupelle, he found out that his own daughter had surrendered about a month earlier. And this was kind of devastating to him. And so he listened to Legare and decided that he just could no longer hold out. His people were destitute, and the future looked extremely bleak. And so in July of 1881, he started moving down toward Fort Buford. He had to wait until there was plenty of grass so that his animals could feed, and that they could do a little hunting along the way in order to sustain themselves. July 19th of 1881, he formally surrendered his rifle to Major Brotherton at Fort Buford. There were 187 people with him. There were 44 men only. The rest were women and children. And 3 days later, he was put on a steamer, he and his people. They were brought to Bismarck. They were docked here for about 3 or 4 hours. He was a hit. Everybody wanted to see that famous and feared Sioux leader. He was given a dinner at one of the local hotels. He had been taught how to write his name, and so he signed a few autographs for a few people, was hustled back on the boat and was taken down to Fort Randall, where he was made a prisoner of war for 2 years.
Those days that he was at Fort Buford, was he incarcerated?
I think what has happened was that he was living in their own tents right outside the fort environs, right outside the buildings, and under the guard of the soldiers. Mm-hmm. So yes, in respect, he was incarcerated, not in jail as such, but under the watchful eye. House arrest, I suppose, would be the best thing to say.
Is that basically the last major interaction between Fort Buford and the Indians of the Northern Plains?
Yes, it is. After that, life became very mundane and quite boring. And
basically, there were nothing more than skirmishes thereafter.
A few skirmishes. There were periodic Indian young men who wanted to leave the reservation to try to capture the old way. They were chased back on the reservation. Also, outlaws began to move into the region because you had a lot of settlers coming, and when you've got settlers, you've got a few goodies, and there were few lawmen, and so the soldiers at Fort Buford had to provide some civilian law enforcement for the settlers who were living in the area.
Did the soldiers at Fort Buford play any role in the Maytee uprisings in Canada in the 1870s and the 1880s? Was there any interaction as a result of that?
There was not the warfare, but the Maytee hunted that whole northern tier of North Dakota into Montana, and they were suspected of illegally selling ammunition and guns and liquor to the Indians, and kind of agitating the Indians to fight against the Americans. And so there were several times when the Maytee groups would be caught by a troop coming out of Fort Buford. They were brought to Fort Buford, they were divested of their goods, and they were taken up to the border and told to scat across and not to show their faces, back across the border. A large group of them were captured in Montana in 77, I think 77, 78. They were brought to Fort Buford and kind of their wrists slapped, so to speak, and then taken up to the border and told to stay north of the border.
And sent on their way.
Yeah.
Indeed. So basically, Fort Buford's lifetime pretty much had come to the string for Fort Buford, if you could say that, ran out in the 1890s. Can you describe the end of Fort Buford?
Yes, it was kind of a slow death. The Congress, I suppose, as Congress has always been, was always slow to appropriate money for the upkeep of the military posts. And so buildings would quickly deteriorate, and by the late or the middle 1890s, many of the buildings were in terrible shape. And when General Brooke took over as the commanding officer of the Department of Dakota in 1895, he felt it obligatory to come out here and just take a look at the posts under his command. A lot of them had already been abandoned. Fort Rice had been abandoned, Fort Totten had been abandoned, Fort Stevenson was no longer around, and all of those in eastern North Dakota were also abandoned. And so when he got out here, he found the troops were in very good condition, quite military, but that the buildings were in terrible shape. And so he ordered that the post be abandoned because militarily it was no longer necessary. The frontier had come and gone. Many historians say that 1890 is the last year of the frontier. You had the Battle of Wounded Knee having taken place. That was the last Indian uprising in this area at all. And so settlers were really permeating the whole area up here. And the fort was really a fort among the wheat fields, so to speak. And so he told the commanding officer that the post would be abandoned and that the officer was supposed to get a couple of officers and survey all the buildings and place a valuation upon them, and that they would then be sold at public auction. The Army issues an order to abandon it militarily. The troops were told to go to Fort Assiniboine, which was in Montana, northern Montana. And a man who had come to Fort Buford in 1879, John Mercer, who had stayed on as a civilian employee of the Quartermaster Corps, was asked to be caretaker. It was suggested that he be paid $50 a month or something like that. Congress, in its wisdom, and the Army decided that he could do it for nothing, and so he did. For what reason, I'm not sure. And officially in October 1 of 1895, the military left. At the end of October, the Secretary of War had the President sign a proclamation, a general order, which turned it over to the Department of the Interior. And they turned it over to the General Land Office, which was under the Department of the Interior, to survey it and then open it up for civilians to homestead on.
Basically, the buildings then were sold at auction?
Yes. In 1897, they were finally sold at public auction. It is said that many buildings were bought and moved off by people from Williston, North Dakota, and I'm sure there were a number of farmers around the military reservation who also took advantage of these buildings.
And we would be remiss if we didn't note that among the last units at Fort Buford were the Black Infantry.
Yes, the 10th Cavalry, I'm not sure the two companies, one of them was Company H, I know that, was there. And they had been there for several years. I think it's about 3 years in the 1890s.
So basically, our story of Fort Buford begins with the necessity to move the Indians from the northern plains and ends with kind of a whimper as the frontier has passed it by.
That's right.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've been chatting with historian Ronald Phil Warner of the State Historical Society of North Dakota with regard to the history of Fort Buford and its role in the Northern Plains military frontier. Thank you. My name is Larry Remley.